In this unit, we're making a transition from the first half of the course to the second half of the course. In the first half of the course, we spoke about philosophy in what I think of as a series of horizontal dimensions. What we did was we took philosophy as a discipline and broke it down to 4 kinds of sub-questions. And I've got them arrayed here on the board: metaphysics, epistemology, issues of human nature, and ethics. And then what we did was we took each of those branches and we had a unit where we looked more in depth at one major issue. We looked at one major issue in metaphysics, then one major issue in epistemology, and then the same for human nature and for ethics. And along the way, we sketched some implications for educational practice. Now, when we did the issue in metaphysics, the issue that we singled on was the big divide in the history of philosophy between those who approach metaphysics naturalistically. That is to say, they see the universe as a self-contained, self-governing system, the natural world, and that we can explain in principle the way the world works without reference to God or the gods or any sort of a higher supernatural realm. And the position at the other end of the spectrum here that denies that says if we're going to understand the universe, we have to understand it in terms of its creation, its organization, perhaps its ongoing maintenance by a power or powers superior to the natural world. Now, when we presented the issue in the metaphysics unit, we presented it in fairly polarized form, strengthening the contrast between naturalism and supernaturalism. That is a legitimate but also a controversial way of presenting the issues. And so what I've done is arrayed the 2 positions here along a spectrum, because there are, of course, those who will argue that it's not necessary to polarize the 2 positions, but there are compromise positions or integration positions between the naturalist position and the supernaturalist position. And so there are people who end up taking metaphysical positions all along the spectrum, those who are strongly naturalistic, those who are strongly supernaturalistic, and then various combination positions that stake out territory trying to combine naturalism and supernaturalism in varying ways. So we don't want to prejudge that issue. When we did epistemology, again, we presented a polarized debate. At one end of the spectrum, we presented arguments and analyses based on a strong advocacy of reason, arguing here that the way we come to know the important things in life is through the use of reason. We do observing the world, we classify the world, we run experiments, and then in sophisticated forms we will run scientific experiments and use the apparatus of scientific method. And then, and only then, to the extent that we've gone through those processes, do we come to know, right, important truths about the universe. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we emphasized a position that's a strong faith position, arguing that the important truths that we need to know, or important beliefs that we have to have about the world, are either not accessible by reason or are contradicted by reason, but nonetheless they are things that we should believe, and so we should make a faith commitment to come to believe those things as well. And again, when we did the epistemology unit, we presented those in fairly strong contrast to each other, but again, there are people who try to combine reason and faith in various ways, and so we'll leave that as an open project here and just say there's a spectrum of positions possible, from advocacy of reason purely to faith purely, or any combination right along the way. When we did issues in human nature, we presented 3 positions in contrast to each other. At one end of the spectrum, we had a position we called reductive materialism. This position, as the name suggests, says that human beings are purely material, anything that we might want to call a soul or a consciousness or a mind. We reduce it to underlying material processes. We don't explain them in their own terms or see them as a different kind of thing or as any sort of an emergent property that needs additional explanation. Instead, we can speak purely the language of material processes. The other end of the spectrum, we had the traditional dualist position called dualism, arguing that the physical side and the psychological side of our natures are two different and in some cases opposed kinds of stuff that happen to conjoin or be conjoined for a temporary period while we're living here on this earth. Then we had a third position that we presented here, and I'm going to put it in the middle and called it integrationism. And as the name suggests here, we need to see from this perspective the human psychology and the human physique, right, as an integrated, codependent, interdependent, co-functioning system that for purposes of analysis you can talk about the psychological independently from the physical and vice versa, but in reality it's an integrated system and has to be explained on those terms. In ethics, we did a similar thing. At one end of the spectrum, we spoke about an approach to values and the good life called predation, right, arguing that we do live in a zero-sum universe, that human beings are fundamentally in conflict with each other. And so it's a matter of the strong prevailing over the weak and making sure that one is either not a weak person, and so setting oneself up for being a victim, and cultivating in oneself the predatory traits that will enable you to succeed in that kind of a world. Other end of the spectrum, we developed a position, called it altruism. This ism, as a matter of principle, arguing that one is a good person only to the extent one does not do what's in one's self-interest. Instead, one always considers the other or the alter, and it's one's service to others or sacrifice to others that marks one's goodness as a human being. And then a third position, I'm going to put a dotted line here because I don't really think that's a compromise between the two, but nonetheless it agrees with some things on the predation model and some things on the altruism model, and disagrees also fundamentally with both of them. This is the position that we called egoism. And the egoists argue that human beings should pursue their happiness, should pursue their own lives, as their standard of value and goodness to be achieved, but that human beings should recognize other people's equal legitimate interest in doing so, and to the extent that we have social interactions with each other, it shouldn't be a matter of sacrificing other people to oneself or sacrificing oneself to other people, but rather working out mutual trade or mutually beneficial relationships. Okay, that was the what I think of as broadly as the first unit of the course, plunging in and getting familiar with doing metaphysics, doing epistemology, doing human nature, and doing ethics. Now, there are lots of other sub-issues in all four of these categories that we did not talk about at all, or we had glancing discussions of as we went through. Instead, we did a trade-off for depth on some of these issues in order to cover them in some depth. Some of the other issues that come up we will see as we go through the semester and start to consider philosophy, what I'm now going to call vertical philosophy. This is philosophy arrayed horizontally. What we're now going to do is turn to what I call isms. Like idealism and realism and pragmatism and the others that we'll be looking at this semester. And what an ism is a system of philosophy where the philosopher or the philosophers as a school have gone through the metaphysical issues and staked positions on all of the major metaphysical issues. They've done the same for the epistemology, the human nature, and the ethics. So there might be 40, 50, 60, or 70 major issues in philosophy that one has to consider. One takes a position on all of them and then puts them together in a package, hopefully an integrated package or a consistent and coherent package, but that then becomes a whole philosophy, a philosophy of life or a philosophy of the universe, and then that philosophy is given a label. So what we're then going to be looking at are positions, right, that are integrated positions of all of the sub-issues. So the isms take a position on metaphysics, they take a position on epistemology, human nature, and so forth. It may be, for example, that they are naturalistic in their metaphysics, or they advocate a kind of faith in their epistemology and integrationism in human nature, but predation in ethics. And another ism might take another different set of positions, and so they as packages, disagree with each other. All right, to telegraph what we're going to be doing over the course of the next 7 units, right, as I think of them, I've got on the board here the 7 isms that we're going to be talking about: idealism, realism, pragmatism, behaviorism, existentialism, Marxism, and postmodernism. And what I want to do is array them on the spectrum, the four spectrums that we have here, to get a sense for how they differ from each other. I've selected these 7 for this course in philosophy of education, in part because all of them have been enormously influential on the course of 20th century education. All of them are still operative significantly in 21st century education. And so if you want to understand the educational landscape, particularly the philosophical landscape in education now, you have to know something about these philosophies and what they predict for educational practice. But it's hard. Any of these issues, metaphysical, epistemological, right, and so forth, many difficult and abstract issues in and of themselves that bear a great deal of thinking. When you then start talking about entire packages of philosophical beliefs, taking any number of metaphysical positions and combining them with epistemological, human nature, and ethics positions, it becomes even more difficult then in this course, as we want to take all of that abstract philosophical theory and apply it to see how practically it's going to work out for all of the major strategic decisions we make when we're doing education, for the teachers we're going to hire, what we include in our curriculum, how we assess our students, what particular pedagogical techniques and so forth and so on that we do in education. All of that is very difficult, and it's a great deal of work. So to help telegraph, as I suggested, where we are going, I want to place the 7 on one visual layout so we can get a sense for what the range of opinion is going to be and where the sticking points in educational practice most likely are going to be. All right, let's start with idealism here, and to help keep things a little more organized visually, what I'm going to do is assign purple to the idealists, and I'll draw a rectangle, and I'll put idealism kind of on these 4 spectrum here, where the idealists stand in terms of these purple rectangles. On the metaphysical issues here, the idealists are tending strongly toward the supernatural side of the spectrum here. So I'm going to put them here, and so they stake out a certain amount of territory. The degree of supernaturalism and distance from naturalism can vary among idealists. Right? Idealists are an ancient school, and there have been many variations on idealist themes. But nonetheless, what the idealists share in common with each other metaphysically is a disagreement with the naturalistic approach and an emphasis on our having to understand the world in terms of a realm beyond the natural world. Now, it's a little more complicated, as one might expect in philosophy, because idealists can disagree with themselves or among themselves over any number of issues. One of the big divides in the history of idealist thought is between the kind of idealists who are more explicitly religious in their idealism and those that are not explicitly religious in their idealism, or who, while they will agree with many of the central insights and metaphysical approaches of religious schools of thought, don't believe perhaps in a personal God or personal gods, or in any way personalize what they take the higher supernatural realm to be. So, for example, we might have very strong supernaturalists, say the Western monotheistic religious traditions. They will speak of a God who is a person who has beliefs and cares about us and is actively managing our affairs in many respects. Some of the idealists, though, when they're talking about the supernatural realm, won't speak of it in personal terms at all. They will speak of being, right, with a capital B, or ultimate reality, and there's no presuppositions there that ultimate reality is aware of our existence or has any particular value connection to us. So, with those general qualifications in mind, just idealists are somewhere along this part of the spectrum here. Now, that distinction is important, though, because when we turn to epistemological issues, while the idealists share a distrust of, or in some cases an outright opposition to, what we might call a principled scientific empirical approach to reason, they also will vary, right, in their degrees of distancing self from that realism. It is true to say that in the more religious versions of idealism, faith is given strong emphasis. The higher truths are either completely inaccessible to reason. Reason is, from that perspective, not able to understand the supernatural realm at all, or in some cases, what one is to believe epistemologically about the higher realm is something that is contrary or contradictory to reason. And so in the strong versions of faith, such as we saw with Kierkegaard, for example, a strong advocacy of faith requires that one deny altogether reason. However, some of the idealists are more reason-friendly, and what they will advocate is a position that is, I'm going to call it somewhere in around here, kind of a pure reason position. That is to say, a reason purified of empirical sensory observations. And so in that sense, they are more reason-friendly, and they won't believe that we should accept everything on faith. But nonetheless, it's not the hardcore principled science approach to reason. So we'll just say that the idealists tend to stake out this part of the spectrum, right, epistemologically. Without exception, the idealists tend strongly to dualism. Some of them might make a move in some direction toward integrationism, but typically the idealists will see the human being as a microcosm of the metaphysical, and if the metaphysical is partly natural and partly supernatural, or partly physical and partly spiritual, then they will see the human being in those same dualistic terms. And then when we turn to ethics, most of the advocates of idealism are in varying degrees altruistic. Some of them are incorporating and moving in some direction toward egoism, the idea being that one can, for example, in religious idealism, achieve bliss, personal bliss in heaven, and that's an ultimate reward for living the good life. Some of them are more strongly renunciatory, arguing that ethics is strictly a matter of duty, sacrifice, renunciation, without any emphasis on a personal reward at all. Instead, one is to devote oneself to the service of others, to the service of God, or to the other people. And for the non-religious versions of idealism, there tends to be the same sort of array, so ending up in this part of the spectrum, so to speak. All right, let me shift color and take up realism and do the same thing here. By realism, we'll be looking at idealism's longest-running historical adversary. The earliest religious traditions and the Platonists are representative of idealism here. Realism begins philosophically most significantly with Aristotle, and Aristotle was a student of Plato's, and so it's not as old as idealism, but it nearly is so. Realists in their metaphysics tend to the naturalistic end of the spectrum here. Some of them will be non-supernaturalistic altogether. It is possible as a realist to be religious, and so we will put an arrow saying that one can go in this direction here. But the kind of religion, the kind of God that realists will believe in typically is very different than the kind of God and the kind of religion that comes out of supernaturalism, or sort of out of idealism, supernaturalism. We'll say more about that when we talk about the differences between the two in a later unit here. The realists in their epistemology are typically opponents of faith, typically advocates of reason, typically advocates of empirical reason, scientific method, and so forth. Some of them, again, who are religious, will argue that a compromise position is worked out or can be worked out between reason and faith, that there are two ways of coming to the same sets of truths. So among some realists, there's a tendency to make a compromise with faith here, but nonetheless, for the realists, reason is almost always given at least first pride of place philosophically here. All of the major realists in their view of human nature have tended to integrationism, staking out this middle territory here. Some of them will lean in a dualistic direction, some of them will lean in a reductive materialist direction, but you tend not to find either of the extremes among the realists. You find them then, so to speak, in the middle of the road here. In the ethics, what we will find is most of the realists are advocates of a kind of egoism, Aristotle advocating a pursuit of happiness, self-realization kind of ethic. John Locke in the modern world is an example of realism here, again arguing for liberty of the individual, pursuit of happiness as the human birthright. Some of them also will tend a little bit toward altruism, but the point is that realists tend to hang out and live comfortably in this part of the spectrum. All right, let me change color again. And I will go now to the pragmatists, and we'll assign to them a green. Turning into a square here. Pragmatists, for the most part, are more naturalistic in their philosophical approach, like the realists are. Again, there are some of the pragmatists, William James is an example here, who are more religion-friendly, and so there is some variation among the pragmatists here, but nonetheless the pragmatists are explicitly tilting strongly toward naturalistic understandings of the universe. The pragmatists are typically opponents of faith, typically opponents of mysticism. Again, William James is an exception here, his being an advocate of a certain kind of faith under certain circumstances. But for the most part, what you find is that the pragmatists are strong advocates of an empirical, a reason-based approach to epistemology. But what differentiates them strongly from the realists is that they are not as gung-ho about the powers of reason, or they're not as sold on our capacity, the capacity of our reason to come to understand general and universal truths about the nature of the world. And so while they tend to be advocates of reason, they have a typically healthy dose of skepticism or fallibilism about the powers of reason built into them, and so I'll put them a little further along the spectrum this way. So they will tend to live on that spectrum there. The pragmatists, in terms of their human nature, again, there's quite a range here, and some of them tend toward a more reductive materialist approach, some tend to a more integrationist approach. I'm not aware of any pragmatists who tilt strongly toward a dualistic account of human beings. The ones that I'm familiar with are in this area here. In the ethics of pragmatists, most of the pragmatists are somewhere in the area of emphasizing the individual and the individual's pursuit of his or her interests. Some of them are more strongly emphasizing the social and the communal. In the case, for example, of William James, James, I think, tilts a little more strongly in this direction here. John Dewey, another major pragmatist, tilts more strongly in this direction here. So there's a range in this part of the spectrum, right, as well. All right, let's now turn to behaviorism, and I will assign the behaviorists orange. Behaviorists, metaphysically, are ruthlessly naturalistic, all of the major ones. I don't believe there are any of the major behaviorists who have any sympathy or leanings toward religious or idealistic accounts of the universe, so I put them at the far end of the spectrum here. In their advocacy, epistemologically, they are gung-ho advocates of a very strong empirical observation, experiment-based scientific method. Everything has to be run through that epistemological orientation. In their view of human nature, the behaviorists rather are strongly materialistic, are seeing the human being as explicable totally in terms of being a biological system that is very malleable by physical environmental circumstances. When we turn to the ethics issues, the behaviorists then become complicated. And one of the reasons why it becomes complicated, I'm going to pause at this moment here for a little sidebar, is to say that one of the implications for the behaviorist view of epistemology is that any talk about normative issues, about values, about the meaning of life and so forth, all of that is, from their perspective, unscientific. It's not something that you can capture in a test tube. You can't run an experiment on it. And so one of the mainstream official behaviorist positions is to say that there is no such thing as a science of ethics or even a discipline of ethics. And so from their perspective, they would just deny that there is any such thing here. So I will put an X over here off the line as representing one possible approach behavioristically. One qualification I can add at this point, though, about the behaviorists is that, well, I think it's fair to say that officially they don't believe, as a matter of philosophical principle, that ethics is a real discipline here. As a matter of practice, many of the behaviorists will stake out various normative positions or come to have certain ethical values and advocate them. So I'll mention B.F. Skinner as an example here. In one of his works he did called Walden II, design what he took to be an ideal society, and his ideal society has all kinds of values built into it in his calling it an ideal society. And as it happens, it's a fairly kind of authoritarian, communally based society. So I'll put a broken lines box in this case to represent Skinner in practice on that part of the ethics spectrum behavioristically. All right, let me change color again, and in this case I want to go to existentialism. And I think it's appropriate for existentialism that we use black. All right, existentialists on their metaphysics, complicated. One of the ways in which they're complicated is most of the existentialists will argue that there is no such thing as an absolute truth, a right answer to whether the universe is ultimately naturalistic, right, or not. Most of the major existentialists, I think it is true to say, are non-religious, right? They will take God's being dead to be a central truth, right, about the universe that we have to advocate, but they won't advocate that dogmatically. And they will also, most of the non-religious existentialists recognize that there is a significant minority tradition of thinkers who are existentialists who are religious in their orientation. And so there's a range of positions that are possible, right, for the existentialists. The existentialists epistemologically will argue that traditional faith is illegitimate, kind of that unthinking acceptance of whatever one's parents taught you or whatever you hear in church. That's an inauthentic position for one to take epistemologically. At the same time, they are skeptical about reason, and they don't believe that reason's claims, say through science, to figure out the ultimate truths about the universe, also are legitimate. And so what they will argue is that there is a kind of non-rational commitment that is built into any sort of commitments, belief-wise or cognitive-wise, that one makes. So what I'm going to do, and this is an interpretive move here, is say that the existentialists are an advocate of a kind of faith. They don't think that traditional religion or science can tell us, right, what the right thing to believe is, or that through reason we can figure out what the truths are, but ultimately there is some sort of a non-rational commitment that goes on in forming anyone's belief system, and I think that's closer to a faith position, however non-standard. And their views on human nature, again, the existentialists are a little bit complicated. One of the more provocative claims that at least one of the major existentialists has made is to say that there is no such thing, right, as human nature. That may sound like an absurd claim, and one can interpret it in a number of ways. But at least then on one line, existentialist-wise, one can say that, again, this is not a legitimate, there is no such branch, right, of philosophical inquiry, that the human being is radically tabula rasa, and what one becomes as a human being then is totally a matter of choices or various other factors, right, that one makes. Again, here, though, I'm going to make a slight interpretive move, and I'm going to put the existentialists, for the most part, over here, because I do think there is a kind of lurking dualism in most of existentialism. We'll talk about this issue more when we explore them. The idea being that whatever value commitments one comes to have, or whatever one comes to take the meaning of one's life to be, that being very important to what your human identity is, that has nothing to do with any sort of physicalistic or biological or natural facts about oneself or the world. So there's a kind of duality between whatever we are given naturalistically and what we come to believe psychologically, and I think that tilts the existentialists in a more dualistic direction here. When we come to the ethics, again, existentialism is complicated. One of the things that is foundational to most existentialists in their ethics is that there is no right answer that is handed to us by religion, that science can't provide us right answers about the important questions of how we're supposed to live and what the meanings of our lives are. So we can, again, put an X over here and say, you know, there is no such thing as the right answer to these ethics issues here. And then we can add the qualification that despite that being, say, the official position that one would take existentialist, as an existentialist, if you look at the beliefs that the actual major existentialist writers advocate, most of them tend fairly strongly toward, I'll put this in again, a dotted box, toward a kind of altruism, and many of them also will include some egoistic, finding significance for your life as an individual right in the world approaches as well. But I think the center of gravity tends more in a communal and altruistic direction for the existentialists. All right, let's turn now to Marxism as the sixth one on our list, and the natural color here to use is red. All right, Marxists, metaphysically, militantly naturalistic, perhaps even more so than the behaviorists. In their view, there is no spiritual world, there is no supernatural world. That metaphysics is not just wrong, but it's also dangerous and destructive. Hence the militant adjective that I used here. And their views on human nature, there's an interesting set of possibilities here. On one respect, the Marxists will argue that human beings are, by their human nature, conditioned by their environmental circumstances. So to the extent that one believes that human beings are simply conditioned to believe what they believe, then one ends up in a kind of epistemological skepticism that one is not believing on a basis of personal faith commitment, nor on the basis of a reasoning through of various positions. But in terms of its self-description, Marxism advocates a kind of reason, arguing that we can study nature scientifically, empirically, that we can gather historical data and put a proper historical interpretation on where things have come. And the self-description label that the Marxists will use is a scientific approach to socialism, the science part capturing their take on the epistemology, which is a kind of reason-based here. In their view of human nature, I did mention the environmental determinism. Like the behaviorists, the Marxists are usually fairly strongly reductive materialists, arguing that humans do have a biological package that they're born with, but nonetheless it's extraordinarily plastic, and it can be shaped by physical, environmental circumstances, and in the Marxist case, particularly economic circumstances that people find themselves in. When we turn to the ethics issue, I want to put the Marxists in two positions here. One is the Marxists spend a great deal of time, obviously advocating not just a philosophical position, but a certain political view, and they see all of their philosophy as supporting their political view or as an outgrowth of a foundational political group. Position, but what they're doing in advocating their philosophy, their politics rather, and the philosophies behind it, and critiquing other politics and philosophy, is a great deal of time critiquing what they take to be predatory philosophies, predatory economic and political systems. So I'm going to use this dotted line over here, arguing that in their analysis, descriptively, when they're doing descriptive ethics, much of their history is to say that the organization of society has historically tended in one way, shape, or form toward various forms of predatory ethics. But in their own advocacy, the kind of ethics that they believe is the right kind of ethics that would be in place once their political system is put in place. They have a strongly communal, communitarian, hence communistic, and altruistic, selfless, and so forth, all of that vocabulary built into their ethics. I'm now going to turn to the last of the isms here, postmodernism, and I will go back to purple, cycling through the colors here. But I've used the squares, or the rectangles rather, for idealism. So for the postmodernism positions, I'm going to use a different shape. I'll use a triangle here. All right, postmodernism, complicated. When we turn to it, I think it will be fair to say that the postmodernists are, for the most part, an integration of some of the earlier systems. In much of their epistemology, they draw on pragmatism. In much of their analysis of society, they are drawing on Marxism. In much of their view of the human condition and the quest for meaning of life, they're drawing on themes that come out of existentialism. There's even a little bit of behaviorism that one can throw in there. And what that then means is postmodernism as a system is somewhat complicated. Now, one of the things that's built into postmodernism metaphysically, though, is an official view that there is no such thing, right? That one of the lessons they will argue we should draw from the history of metaphysics and this ongoing debate between the naturalists and the supernaturalists is that there is no such thing as a right answer to the question whether God exists or doesn't exist, whether we can explain the universe in naturalistic terms or not. And for that reason rather, many of the postmodernists will describe themselves as anti-metaphysical. So one official position that the postmodernists rather can say, and I'll put it out here, is then just to deny that there's a possible position that one can take metaphysically. So we'll just put that out here. That said, most of the postmodernists, in terms of what they actually believe, most of them are non-religious, non-idealistic, and so I think their default position is a kind of naturalism. So I'll put a dotted line somewhere in this world, right? Well, if we just take naturalism to be not a supernaturalism. In terms of the epistemology, most of the postmodernists are strongly skeptical, and they spend a great deal of time attacking reason, or what they take to be the pretensions of reason, the pretensions of the scientific method. That's just one way of looking at things. They also will spend a great deal of time attacking traditional faith-based and mystic-based approaches to religion as well. And so they will again argue that perhaps there is no such thing as epistemology as traditionally conceived. There is no such thing as knowledge. There is no such thing as a means of coming to know a true story of the universe. And so again, we can put the postmodernists off the spectrum in the sense of just denying that there is, right, any sort of thing here. Part of this has to do with the postmodernist view of human nature. Again, the postmodernists are like the behaviorists, like the existentialists, arguing that human beings can be conditioned by the social environment in which they are raised. They're inculcated with certain linguistic traditions, and that shapes their thinking and what they come to believe to be true. But there are different linguistic traditions out there in the universe, and so people then come to have very different traditions. On that view, there is a kind of reductive materialism that is built into most of postmodernism, but again with the dotted lines, because they would not ever say the truth of the world is that it's a material system that operates certain sorts of ways, and at the same time they are also opposed to dualism, which is why I'm putting them more at this spectrum here. They are denying that there's anything like a mind or a spirit or a soul or even reason, right, that can autonomously function independently of shaping conditions here. All right, when we turn to ethics, again, the postmodernists are skeptical about ethics. They don't think that there is such a thing as a science of ethics, or that traditional religious ethics has any sort of a lock on the truth. And so one thing that we can do is say that the postmodernists are anti-ethics as a branch of philosophy. Instead, all we have is cultural conditioning or linguistic conditioning, and so all we can do is really just describe the positions that people end up believing in when it comes to value issues. But that said, I'm going to put the postmodernists, for the most part, somewhere over on this part of the spectrum here, because if you look at their actual normative beliefs, like the Marxists, from whom they've learned a great deal, they tend to see most belief systems as containing strongly predatory elements in them, and then when they are themselves advocating particular things, they tend to advocate much more communal and social and altruistic approaches to ethics. All right, that said, this is philosophy vertically. That is to say, if you look at the colored boxes and you put them together, what we have is, in the case of idealism, a package here. The idealists believe this metaphysically, this epistemologically, this in terms of human nature, and this in terms of the ethics. And the other 7 are arrayed differently along the spectrum in different packages. And this then leads into the second reason why, in the second part of the course, I've chosen the 7 isms that I did. I chose all of them in part, as I mentioned, because they've all been very influential on the course of 20th century education and still in the 21st century. But I also picked them for philosophical reasons, in that they all represent different groupings. And as you can see, most of the areas on the different spectrums are staked out by different systems. So we have some that are strongly tilting here, some that are strongly tilting over this end of the spectrum, some of them that are trying to put compromise positions or mix and match types of positions as we go along here. And I think this is important. It's important so that we can understand philosophically the landscape of American education, why things are going the way they are going, why there's this inconsistent array of pedagogical techniques, curricular elements, and philosophical justifications for them. It's because all 7 of them, these isms here, are operative, and they are very different packages in collision over educational matters. And I think also, though, it's useful for students who are learning philosophy, particularly students who are learning philosophy and who are planning to become teachers, since education is an intensively philosophical enterprise, to have some experience, not only with all of the issues, or the major issues that are possible in philosophy, but all of the major schools of philosophy that are operative in the educational world. So that puts them in a position in the first place to sort through for themselves as students what they're going to believe and what they're then going to put in practice, which philosophy is going to inform their strategic thinking about their educational practice. But then also when they come across other teachers, other parents, and other administrators in the education system who are coming at those same set of issues differently, we can have informed conversations and discussions and debates where you understand where the other guys are coming from and why they believe what they do. And so hopefully critique their positions and be open to critiques from their position, and have a position in response to that is articulate and so forth. So a line from Pico della Mirandola, a Renaissance thinker, who argued that really, this is not quite a direct quote, but the point was that to form your own views on philosophical issues, it's necessary first to have acquaintance with all of the views that are possible. And that is what we're going to do over the course of the next 7 units in the course. All right, one more mini unit before we turn to the first ism, idealism, of the semester in the transition session here. Philosophy is hard, education is hard, seeing the connections in many cases between philosophy and education is also hard. So what we're doing is we're making a transition in part from philosophy theory to educational practice. And to help that transition, there's one thing that I think is useful when you're reading a philosopher of education or an education theorist who is philosophical, or someone who's strategic about education, you're thinking through the issues, is if you can identify what their top educational value is, that is to say, what they think the most important thing education is or should be about, in many cases that clarifies many of the other strategic decisions that they're making, or the implementation decisions that they're making in the rest of the educational theory. And it also can tell you something very significant about where they're coming from philosophically. So what I want to do is talk through a few of the major answers to the question of what the top educational value can and should be. Now, there are many such things that we want education to do. If we ask what students should learn or be able to do, or what we want them to achieve by the time they end their educational system formally, well, the list can run to hundreds and if not thousands of things here. So what we're looking for is a very abstract, top-level organizing value And on my reading of the history of the philosophy of education, history of educational practice, there have been 6 such values. Knowledge, method, skills, individuality, socialization, and morality. So I've got them written on the board here. And all of these should sound attractive to you, but what I'll be interested in is not just are they important, but if pinch comes to shove and we're up against budgetary constraints or we're up against time constraints, which one is going to be given precedence rather if we can't do both or all in any given set of time or in any given budget. Now the rationales for each of these are fairly straightforward, and you've no doubt heard all of them, so let me run through those fairly important, quickly rather. Knowledge. Knowledge is important. By the time we are adult human beings, there are thousands and thousands of things we need to know. We need to have them at our fingertips. We have to be able to have them stored away in our memory, ready for instant recall. And so education in large part then is a matter of, particularly for a cognitive being such as we are, stuffing as many facts and as many items of knowledge into students' heads as we possibly can, so they're ready to use them by the time they leave. The point about method is to say that the fabulous apparatus that is the human mind and the human brain, that it works by specific methods, it has certain powers and certain flexibilities that are possible to it, but students don't automatically know how to do this. And so if we're going to have students have the full power and flexibility of the minds by the time that they're done. Knowledge is important, but it's also important for students to know how to use their minds, how to observe, how to classify, how to do various analytic and synthetic techniques and so forth. And in many cases, the particular items of knowledge that are important in this generation will become outmoded or outdated by the next generation. And so what we want is not to stuff students' heads with knowledge that might become outdated, but rather give them the tools so that they can discover the new knowledge and the new variations in the next generation. Another emphasis, top value, is skills. In many cases, educational practitioners will say that the important thing is not necessarily knowing that something is true, but knowing how to do something, or that book learning, right, or theoretical knowledge may have a certain amount of value, but it's not as important as actually being able to operationalize that knowledge. So that students should learn by doing, they should know how much more than know that, and so the behavioral, the existential, the practical, the action-oriented approach to education is important here. We want students to grow up to be individuals, to have their own minds, to know their own minds, to be able to form their own beliefs independently, not simply to believe what we told them, not necessarily to disagree, but nonetheless to disagree when appropriate in their judgments, and to if they do agree with us, to agree because they've done so by their own independent mind, to form their own tastes in music, to make their own choices about who their friends are going to be, what their careers are going to be, and so forth. So we want to create someone who is a strong individual and so able to do so. We want students to have strong self-esteem, right? For example, self-esteem is a value that comes out of the individuality tradition. We want students also to be social. In many cases, important things that we do in our lives as social animals involve knowing how to get along with other people and work productively with them and so forth. We have to be diplomatic, we have to be civil, we have to be leaders, followers, co-workers, and so forth in the appropriate kinds of situations. All of these things are very complicated. And so if we think of many of the important things that we do, our friendships, our families, in most cases the way we do business, we do it in a social environment. We're also citizens, we're part of a country, we vote, we might participate more directly in the political process ourselves by running for office. And so learning how to be a full member of society with all of the traits and skills that are necessary are important here. Morality is another important one here. Obviously, when we mention individuality, there's a kind of morality that's built into that. When we mention socialization, there's a kind of morality that's built into that. But it's also possible to abstract out issues of morality, being able to reason through complicated moral situations, to deliberate and debate about moral issues, to have self-discipline and certain traits of integrity and being proactive and persevering, right, and so forth. All of these moral traits can apply both individually and in a social context. So some educational philosophers and practitioners will emphasize a more generic approach to morality as an important, if not the most important issue in education. All of these are values in my judgment, and as we go through the list, there's probably not a great deal of disagreement that all of these things are useful and important things for students to learn. What I want to do, though, is to point out how it's important to prioritize, right, one's sense of which of these values really is the top value, or which combination of them together has to be the top value, because in many cases you can't do it all. You can't have every lesson cover all of them, and in many cases you don't have the budget to cover everything. And so we do know, for example, if we just take, say the average school day has 6 hours, the students show up at 9 and they're done by 3. How much can we cover in 6 hours? How many different curricular units? How many methodological issues? How many group projects, individual projects, and so on can we do? We have to make strategic decisions, partly because of time constraints. Or in many cases, as I mentioned before, it will be budget constraints, right? This year the budget is going to be cut by X thousand dollars, and so that means certain things have to be cut out of the curriculum, or certain kinds of exercises that we ordinarily would do have to be cut out. Well, we cut the things that are, in our judgment, the least important things in order to preserve the most important things, but that presupposes that we've already made some sort of a decision, some sort of a sorting about what the most important things are and what the least important things are. So, for example, one of the big debates is between those who argue that knowledge is more important than method, or that method is more important than knowledge. And the argument here can be on the side of the method people. They will say, if you think about computers, for example, we're having students learn about computers. There's lots of knowledge about computers that is going to be outdated, right, in 20 years. So maybe what we shouldn't be doing is teaching students particular knowledge about how this piece of software works or how this kind of operating system works. Rather, we should be doing something more generic about thinking technologically and being able to think in principle how computer programmers think, kick things up to a higher level of abstraction, because in the next generation, who knows what kinds of operating systems and software is going to be available. And so in that kind of argument, method is more important than particular knowledge about, say, the computer system. Advocates of knowledge will come back and say, well, of course, method is important, but in most contexts in adult life, it's the actual knowledge that you have that's the important thing. You take your car to a mechanic because it needs to be fixed. We want our mechanic to know how to fix the car. We don't want the mechanic to say, well, I know how to research on the internet, right, or whatever proper methods to fix the car. Or if we're going for surgery, we want the surgeon to know the internal structure, right, of your body before he or she cuts you open. We don't want that person to say, I'm a real whiz at researching human anatomy, and I can apply the methods in that case. And of course, there are those who are on the side of skills who will say all of this emphasis on knowledge and method at the abstract level is too abstracted, it's too theoretical, too book learning. What we should be doing in the educational system is teaching students practical hands-on skills, career training, how actually to get things done. Whether they have the pure knowledge or the pure methodological principles behind that's a more of a luxury kind of an item, and so the emphasis should be here, right, and so on. And the debate goes on with the other ones as well. All right, what I want to do, though, just as a brief exercise here, is single out 3 points of educational practice, 3 strategic points where it forces one to make a choice about what the higher values are and what the lower values are. First one I'm going to single out is the issue of hiring teachers. And so we'll do a little thought experiment here. Suppose you had an unlimited budget. Wouldn't that be great? And you're starting your own school, and so you're the principal or the superintendent of the school, and so you're just going to hire however many teachers, and you can hire whomever you want, and the resumes start to come pouring in. All right, so you start sorting through all of the resumes. I'm interested in these ones, not so interested in these ones. Which ones are you going to be interested in? What are you going to be looking for? And the claim I'll make is if any one of these is a top value for you, you're going to be looking for very different things. Now, of course, chances are good you want to have your teachers have some of these traits and be able to teach all of these traits, but in most cases you're not going to get all of them to the maximal degree, and in most cases you're going to say this is more important than that, and so I'm going to hire this person instead of that person. All right, so for example, suppose you're hiring and you start going through resumes and you're a knowledge person. You think the most important thing is we need to have teachers who know an awful lot of stuff, so they're in a position to communicate all of that stuff to students at the appropriate kind of time. So I want someone who's always going to win at Trivial Pursuit, for example, just as a walking encyclopedia, right, kind of person. All right, so I'm exaggerating to make the point that knowledge is your top value here. Now, what are you then going to look for on the resumes or the curriculum vitae as they come in? Well, you will of course look at the student's transcript from their high school courses, from their college courses that they'll have taken. But what you'll be looking for is the person having done well in courses that have a great deal of content. So you'll want them to have taken lots of history courses, lots of science courses in physics and biology and chemistry. You'll want them to know the American politics if you're setting up a school in American situations, so that they can teach civics, right, and so forth. You'll want them to know economics and all of the major works of literature and art history, right, and so forth. So you'll be looking for content courses primarily, and how well the student did on those, and those things will be proxies for how much knowledge in their judgment those people actually have. Now, by contrast, if you're a method person, the kinds of things that you'll be looking for on the person's resume will be a different set of courses. You will be looking for, has this person taken rhetoric courses and grammar courses and composition courses and mathematics courses and critical thinking and problem solving types of courses. Anything that is an abstraction on any particular content of knowledge, but shows that this person has thinking skills, reasoning skills, communication skills, all of the methodology, right? That's important in life. So, if the person got an A in math and an A in logic and an A in critical thinking, but only got a B in American history, well, that might not be so bad. By contrast, if you're a knowledge person, the person's having gotten a B in logic and an A in American history, well, that might not be so bad either. Okay, suppose you're interested in skills. Well, then the kinds of things that you're going to be interested in won't be so much theoretical knowledge courses or theoretical method courses. You'll be looking at, has the person taken, say, a lot of lab courses, right, as opposed to theory courses? Has the person taken a certain number of internships? Does the person have work experience, and so forth? Anything that will indicate that the person has knowledge how to do things and is handy and knows how actually to get things done. Those are the things that you'll be looking for on the resume. All right, suppose we're an individuality person. Now, what we want is a kind of teacher who can cultivate in students their own individuality, to encourage them to pursue their dreams, to be creative and experimental, and all of the things that individuals prize. Well, what we might not then be very interested in is a resume of someone who went to high school, got good grades, and immediately went on to college, got good grades, then went and got the teaching certificate, got good grades, and was kind of a model student, but is kind of a textbook person, or someone who comes in for a resume and is wearing a three-piece suit because that's what you're supposed to wear when you go for an interview if you're a male, right, in our particular culture. By contrast, suppose you got the following kind of resume. You got someone who got middling grades through high school and maybe even dropped out of high school and got a job for a while, traveled around the country for a bit, came back, got their high school equivalency diploma. went off to college for a few years but dropped out, started a business, but the business failed. They started another business. That business succeeded. They made a significant amount of money, say by the time that they were 30. They sold that business off, traveled the world, and then decided, hey, I would really like to be a teacher, went and got this teaching certificate and is now applying to your school. Well, I think if you're an advocate of individuality, that kind of person would be very attractive to you, because here you've got someone who is very experimental, who does try lots of things, who does fail but bounces back from failure and learns from the failure and then goes on to success and so forth. And maybe this person, when he or she shows up for the interview, isn't wearing the three-piece suit, is wearing something that's a little more outlandish, but that then is an indication that you're dealing with someone who is much more independent and so forth. And that might then be a kind of person who's appropriate for being a teacher. Okay, suppose by contrast then that socialization, right, is your number one thing. Well, what will you be looking for? Obviously, you'll be looking for coursework and actual experience that involves all of those skills. So did the person take courses, say, in sociology or the study of different cultures and their different practices? Was the person on student government in high school? Was he or she on the yearbook team? Anything that indicates a serious engagement with the social side of life and the study of social sorts of things, that would then be a kind of prospective teacher who would be attractive to you. All right, suppose we move on to morality. Right? What are we going to be looking for here? Well, it might be the case that the person's a straight A student in all kinds of knowledge disciplines, that is very skilled, has his or her own mind, lots of diplomatic skills, is a whiz at problem solving. But it's possible to have all of those things and not particularly to be admirable morally speaking, right? It's possible to be a schmoozer right here. It's possible to be a fake individual. Right? It's possible to be very skilled at manipulating people and getting out of work, right, and so forth. It's possible to have lots of knowledge and method, but apply those things in unscrupulous ways. So if we're interested primarily in morality, what we're going to be looking for are signs that the person has a strong moral character, and the coursework that they've had, and perhaps even the work experience they have, those are not going to be good proxies for that. So what we might then do, if we are the principal hiring new teachers interested in morality, is not pay very much attention to the student's transcript and so forth. Instead, we will look at the person's references, and we'll take the references very seriously. Instead of saying, as a standard with your job application, include 2 or 3 references, we'll ask for 6 references or 8 references. And we won't just look at them and say, well, they look pretty good. We'll actually call up all of the references, and we'll have extended conversations with people who actually knew the person, and we'll ask fairly probing questions. Is this person a person of integrity, right, perseverance, right, honesty, and all of the traits that we're looking for? And that will be the thing that will be important to us. So whether the person got straight A's, right, in various courses, has good work experiences, is a unique individual, we might be able to trade off or be willing to trade off on all of those things if we're sure that we're getting someone of strong, staunch, dependable moral character who can be the proper kind of role model for our students. Okay, that's one set of examples how differing value priorities on these here will lead to the hiring of very different kinds of teachers. I want to move on and talk about another kind of issue that can come up, a set of curricular issues. We are designing our curriculum, including what we're going to teach and how we're going to teach. Very different kinds of decisions will be made based on the value weights that we have assigned to the 6 things on the list over here, right, for example. Suppose we're teaching chemistry, and we're at the high school level. We might say our goal as knowledge people is for people in the chemistry unit, by the time they are done it, to know the periodic table from helium on through whatever the heaviest element is. To know all of the valences and the atomic weights and the molecular weights and all of the appropriate things there, to have that thing memorized and be very fluid at being able to recall all of the elements and so forth. Now, if by contrast we are a method person, we might not be as interested in students memorizing the periodic table and having that at their fingertips. We might be much more interested in their ability to do the chemical calculations. Can they take the formulas for molecular weight under this, that, or the other circumstances and do the calculations? Can we say if we take this chemical and this chemical here, we put them in various combinations at these temperatures, what's going to happen as a result of the processes? So the student might not come to know all of the elements of the periodic table, but nonetheless the student has a good working knowledge of the methods that one is supposed to use. If we're a skills person, we might be much more interested in lab experience. And so we want the students to be able to go into the lab, to be able, say, actually to use the apparatus in a very hands-on way and in a safe way. And so rather than just memorizing various formulas or knowing the atomic weight of oxygen and so on, to have them be able to go into the classroom and take a sample of air and go through the skillful process of actually isolating a pure sample of air and then doing the various operations to measure it, as chemists will do. All right, so when we're doing our chemistry then, to what extent are we emphasizing knowledge of chemical truths, chemical methods, or chemical skills? Different chemistry professors and chemistry teachers are going to emphasize different things over the course of the semester or a year, depending on what their top value is. Let me switch my example a little bit to focus on individuality and socialization issues. Suppose we're phys ed teachers and we're including, say, tennis in our curriculum. It's spring, we want the students to go outside and play tennis. Do we have them play singles? Do we have them play doubles? Well, if we're a social person, then all of this physical activities that we're going to have them do will involve team sports, because we want them to learn the skills, but we also want to emphasize the social elements and the teamwork issues that go on. And we might not have individual sports at all on our curriculum. On the other hand, if we are individualists and we think that we want students to learn that whether they succeed or not is primarily a matter of their own individual efforts, and that for their successes they get the praise, and for their failures the bottom line is that they can't blame anybody but themselves in the final analysis, then in our phys ed curriculum we're going to emphasize individualistic activities and teach the student those individual skills, and of course also the individual traits that go along. All right, so that's an example of curricular issues that can be affected by socialization or individuality. All right, third thing I want to run through quickly, again, is more at the tail end of the educational process. How do we assess? How do we figure out whether the students are learning or able to do whatever it is that we want to do? Again, which of these things we're looking for and emphasizing will shape what assessment tools, techniques that we use in order to figure out whether we have taught them or whether they have learned what it is that we want them to learn. So clearly, if one's emphasis is on knowledge, then various kinds of fact-based tests to determine whether they have the items of knowledge, that will be the important thing. Do they know the atomic weight of carbon? Do they know the dates of World War I? Do they know the main plot line for Moby Dick, right, and so forth? And so you just test whether they have all of the items of knowledge that they've been exposed to, stored away in memory and accessible at the end of the academic unit. If we're interested in method issues, we're not going to expose them likely to items of knowledge or even problems that they have seen before, because what we're interested in is figuring out whether they know the methods to apply to new kinds of problems. So for example, in a math problem, we will give them a set of equations that they have not seen before and ask them to solve those ones. Right? Or we will put them in a situation where there's an experimental apparatus, and we'll see whether they can apply the apparatus in the proper way to yield the kind of results. But it will involve, say, isolating a chemical that they haven't isolated before, or doing something to it. If we're interested in skills, right, then just cognitive performance, verbal performance might be a component here, but more likely we're going to see, can they actually do, right, whatever it is that we want them to be able to do. So if it's auto shop, for example, can they actually take a transmission apart and put it back together? If it's a case of a theater class, Can they actually wire up the soundboard and have everything operationally working? If it's a chemistry class, can they set up the chemical equipment for a certain kind of experiment and take it apart and clean it and put it away appropriately and so forth. Now, individuality, socialization, and morality, I think these are going to be more complicated, and I think all of them involve a great deal more monitoring of students during the whole of the educational process to be able to make the judgments. These ones here, it's more easily possible to have the students study things for a while and then test them at the end. In the case of individuality, you do have to, as a teacher, come to get to know the student as an individual over a certain amount of time. You have to have a sense for who they were at a certain point, what level of achievement they had, in order to be able to tell how much they've grown as individuals by the end. But here what you'll be looking for is, say, in the cognitive realm. Is this student someone who can take an independent position, or is this student just parroting things because other people said? We don't want parrots. We don't want simple regurgitators. We want students who can take in and form their own opinion, maybe form a contrary opinion or come up with a new angle on various sorts of things. We will be interested, say, in art classes, whether the student is developing a distinct style. In a literature class, can the person read a passage and write a personal response that integrates his or her personal experiences and feelings in response to the literature, and you get a sense in reading it of a distinctive individual. In the case of socialization, the kind of assessment, again, will be more practically oriented. You'll be looking at, over the course of a fairly long period of time, how the student performs in the course of doing group work. Does the person have the appropriate skills of civility? Do other students like them? Do the other students work productively with them? Does the student show leadership appropriately, or by contrast, is the student a parasite on the work of other people? Is the student a bully? Is the student constantly making excuses, right, to other people in the group, right, and so forth? So you're looking for, in your assessment, actual operational socialization, so to speak. All right, morality, another tricky one here, a complicated one, because it involves getting to know the student personally, and usually over a fairly extended period of time. Is the student someone who takes responsibility and has taken responsibility, keeps his or her work area tidy, remembers to do homework and to bring the homework in? Is the student someone, by contrast, who's always making excuses, always procrastinating? Is the student evasive any time that there's a difficult issue that comes up? And of course, people make mistakes. Does the student honestly and forthrightly say, yes, I made a mistake? Or does the student lie about it and try to cover various sorts of things up? One thing we might do as a teacher, a little bit sneaky, but it has been done, is to give the students a test on something or other. Grade the test out of 100. Suppose the student scored 86 on the test, so you add them up and you see that it's 86, but intentionally you write on it that the student gets 91 out of 100. So you hand the student's test back, knowing that the student will do his or her own tally of the results, and you'll see, does the student come to you and say, I think you made a mistake in adding here, I really only got 86 on the test, but you gave me 91. Please correct me. Well, that would tell you something about the student, his or her commitment to honesty, commitment to kind of justice, only wanting what he or she has actually earned. Or does this student take the 91, not say anything about it, and so forth? And that would then tell you also something about the student. The point then is, with respect to assessment, what you're looking for is going to dictate clearly what assessment vehicle you use. And since we can't spend forever on assessing, we have to call our shots strategically, what they're the most important things, so that when we are devoting assessment resources and assessment time, we make sure that we are assessing the things that really matter to us. What I want to do next is turn to actual examples of educational theorists or educational philosophers in the course of a piece of writing, taking a position on what really is important here. And I've got 8 quotations that I want to read to you, representing all 6 of these here. And what's nice about the 8 that I've selected for you is that all of them advocate one of these as being the most important one, but they also contrast themselves to the other ones by de-emphasizing explicitly one or more of the other ones as being a top educational value. And that's a useful thing to do, so you get a little bit of experience how these things actually come at you when you're dealing with educational philosophy and educational theory, because in many cases they don't use these particular words here. They describe the concepts or the values in other formulations, and so practicing seeing how they come at you and interpreting them is a useful thing to go through. So let's do that next. All right, what I want to do next is read to you a series of quotations, and after we read them, interpret them to try to figure out what the person is saying is the top educational value, and also by contrast, what other educational value is not a top value, either being de-emphasized or dismissed entirely. All right, quotation number 1. This is from a book by Michael Oakeshott, a British political philosopher of the 20th century. And here he is quoting a teacher who was enormously influential upon him as a young man. And so here's the quotation. "You go to a great school not so much for knowledge as for arts and habits, for the habit of attention, for the art of expression, for the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual position, for the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation, for the art of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms." End quote. All right, what's nice about this quotation is he's very clear in the first part in terms of what he's against. You go to a great school not so much for knowledge. Knowledge is fine, but that's not the most important thing, Oakeshott's teacher is saying here. Instead, it's arts and habits, and then he goes on to elaborate a number of arts and habits that he thinks are important. So what are all of these things? I think he is advocating method as the most important issue. So let's run through and interpret these specific arts and habits to see how that is so. All right, the first art or habit that he mentions is, quote, the habit of attention. Right? How do you take your mind, which can be unfocused or scattered or focused all over the thing or just in a state of unfocus, and decide to pay attention to something, to focus in on that. Well, it's a method issue about the proper use of one's mind. Second one here, the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual position. So there are lots of intellectual positions out there, being able to think of things this way, then at a moment's notice, as he puts it, step out of that framework and look at it from this perspective, and then look at it from this other perspective, right, and so forth. That's a method issue. How do you use your mind in such a way as to change the operating assumptions and contextualizing principles that one is using there? For the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts. Well, this most often comes up in discussion or in debate. You and I are debating something. I'm stating my position, you're stating your position in response. Well, if that debate is going to be fruitful, I have to be able to state my position, but then when you're stating your response or articulating your position, be able to, in my context, step outside of my way of looking at things and understand where you are coming from and the points that you're making for, in terms of the way that you're doing so. Next, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation. In many cases, debate and discussion involves critiquing each other's positions. So here he's talking about a methodological principle of being able to articulate a position and then take the heat, not put my position out there and run away or insulate myself from criticism, but be able to put my position out on the table and have you attack it, have you criticize it, have you tell me that my position is ridiculous or faulty or weak in various ways, not lose my cool, accept the criticisms for what they are, and formulate my responses if I think responses are possible here. The final one that he mentions is for the habit of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms. Now, in many cases, The positions that we're considering are not obviously true or obviously false. Some of them are. If it's obviously false or ridiculous, we can just dismiss it. But how do you develop in yourself the ability to be able to recognize those things when you come across them? Or things that really are obvious and don't require further investigation? How do you develop that method for being able to make those assessments? And in the more difficult situations where there's some evidence for a proposition or for a position, but it's not overwhelming. And so in that situation, well, it's a possibility. Or if the evidence comes in and now it's really very strong, we say, well, that's probable or highly probable. Or if we get to a situation where the evidence that has come in really is overwhelmingly in support of a given position, being able to assess that it really is overwhelmingly in that position and say things like, well, that's beyond a reasonable doubt, or that's proved with certainty, right, or whatever. So being able to make those judgment calls along that spectrum from the ridiculous to barely possible to a strong possibility to a high probability to a reasonable certainty and so forth. That methodology of assessing evidence is another important cognitive skill here. So I think what we have then in this quotation from Oakeshott's teacher is a strong emphasis on cognitive methods, methods of being able to use one's mind fluidly and powerfully in dealing with difficult matters. That, for Oakeshott, is the heart of education. All right, let's try another quotation here. Second one on my list is from Diane Ravitch, perhaps the most famous and influential educational theorist of the early 20th century, or 21st century now. This is from the year 2009, an article written in the Boston Globe newspaper. Quote, "For over a century, we have numbed the brains of teachers with endless blather about process and abstract thinking skills. We have taught them about graphic organizers and Venn diagrams and accountable talk, database decision-making, rubrics, and level libraries. But we have ignored what matters most." All right, now that then is to say, she's saying all of the things that we've just mentioned, those are not the most important thing. And all of the things that we've just mentioned, stepping outside of the quote here, process, abstract thinking skills, graphic organization, and so forth, those are all method issues, exactly the things that Oakeshott's teacher was saying were the most important thing. So from Ravitch's perspective, method issues are not the most important thing. So what is? Quote, "But we have ignored what matters most. We have neglected to teach them that one cannot think critically without quite a lot of knowledge to think about. Thinking critically involves comparing and contrasting and synthesizing what one has learned. And a great deal of knowledge is necessary before one can begin to reflect on its meaning and look for alternative explanations." All right, so her point is that knowledge is foundational. You have to have lots of knowledge in place before you can start self-reflectively focusing on the methodology issues of verifying and sorting rather, and classifying and interpreting various pieces of knowledge in a higher order kind of fashion. Knowledge is most important, most fundamental. Other things then become secondary. All right, let's try another quotation here. This is from a teacher in the middle part of the 1990s, having written a letter to the editor in response to another article advocating the introduction of computers into the classroom. In the middle part of the 1990s, there was a great wave, a great deal of excitement about the possibility of computers in the classroom, and a great deal of educational resources, budgetary resources were being expended on introducing computers. This teacher was not impressed with computers and particularly underwhelmed by the amount of time and resources that were going to be spent on computers, and the key part of her argument is here. Quote, "Computers, by their very nature, encourage logical, abstract thinking, thereby limiting the child's ability to respond creatively." So interpreting this one, what she is saying is the most important thing in education, or the key thing that we should be attending to in this case, is the child's ability to respond creatively. So what we're interested in is children becoming creative. Creativity is an important feature of individuality, right? Doing things your way, doing things in an innovative way, in a new way, not simply regurgitating or doing regurgitating things that have been fed to you, or doing things the same old way that they've always have been done. So I would say that this teacher rather, is emphasizing that for students, the most important thing is developing their individuality. That's the reason why, on her interpretation, the introduction and emphasis on computer-based teaching is a bad thing. Right? Computers involve machines. The machines are all programmed with the same software. So you have all of the students in the class sitting in front of a machine. They're all doing the same thing according to the same computer script. It's too mechanical. It's too top-down. It's too authoritarian. It's too uniform. Students are being programmed themselves rather than responding individually. That may be a little bit of an over-interpretation, but we see the contrast that she's making here. All right. So not certain logical methods, but rather individuality. All right, next quotation, the fourth on my list here. This goes back to the 1960s, a professor of education arguing very strongly against a certain approach. And this proposition is a little bit complicated because it's a very long sentence that ends in a question mark. But in this sentence, he dismisses one approach to education rather vehemently, and then advocates what he takes to be the opposite. So let's plunge into this quotation here. Quote, "Do we want to use our colleges to produce hundreds of busy little conceptualizers, explainers and verifiers, talkers and analysis makers?" Okay, pause in the quotation. Well, that sounds bad. Doesn't sound like it. Well, what is he dismissing here? Conceptualizers, explainers, verifiers, talkers, analysis makers. Those are all method issues. Abstract, logical, rational, scientific methods. All of that method approach he is dismissing. That's wrong. Picking up the quotation, "At a time when the conceptualizing and analytic mind has been running wild through the world, having detached itself from the simple human virtues of love, compassion, tenderness, and empathy, which it is the task of any education and sensibility to foster," end quote. All right, so what's he in favor of? Well, he does mention simple human virtues. So one possibility is to say, well, if he's going to give us a list of virtues as part of the apparatus of morality, what he's really interested in primarily is morality, not teaching students abstract methodological skills of analysis and so forth, but rather it's about virtue. We want to teach students to be good people, to have moral character. So it's possible, and I think that's a legitimate interpretation, to say that he is in favor of morality as the most important thing. Now, another possibility, though, is to say that this fellow is in favor of socialization, because if you look at the specific virtues that he names 4 of them: love, compassion, tenderness, and empathy. Those are all virtues in the social subset of virtues. Love is a social, compassion is social, tenderness is social, and empathy is social. So we could make an interpretation that says what he's interested in is socialization, right, as his primary value. And we could say that it might be significant that none of the virtues that he talks about are particularly individualistic. He doesn't talk about the virtue of productivity or the virtue of being proactive or leadership or courage or anything that might be a more individualistic kind of virtue. So I think in this case he's against method, particularly certain kinds of method, and is in favor strongly of either moral training or social training as the most important thing. My next quotation, fifth on my list here, comes from John Dewey, one of the very top, most influential educational philosophers of the 20th century. And here's the quotation, quote, "I believe that education is a regulation of the process of coming to share in the social consciousness, and that the adjustment of individual activity on the basis of social consciousness is the only sure method of social reconstruction." Okay, that's fairly clear. The word social is the dominant word there. It's repeated 3 times. Education is primarily about developing a social consciousness, getting students to come to share in the social consciousness. In the second phrase, he says we take the individual and we adjust that individual to share in the social consciousness and on the basis, right, of the social consciousness. So it's not an individualistic approach, it's a socialized approach. And then he tags on at the end, right, that all of this is with an eye towards social reconstruction, that we are readjusting individuals in a particular social consciousness direction because we want to change society or reconstruct society in a certain way. And so certainly we start with individuals in the education process and get them to think socially in a certain way in order to achieve that reconstruction. All right, my next quotation, number 6 on my list here, quote, "We learn how to do things and then learn what we have learned is wrong and right. We learn when our rules apply and when they must be modified. We learn all this by doing, by constantly having new experiences and attempting to integrate those experiences, or more accurately, the memory of those experiences into our existing memory structures. This integration process relies upon new data provided by experience. When new data is simply told to us, we don't know where in memory to put it because we don't really understand the use of that data. When we experience the data ourselves, we also experience at the same time other sights, sensations, feelings, remembrances of goals achieved and goals hoped for, and so on." All right, so what's being emphasized here, I think, is skills, practice, doing, experience, hands-on. And what is being criticized is an emphasis on any sort of method that is too abstracted, too theoretical, too much simply a matter of telling students what they should know, or too much book learning where it's just laid out in abstract words. Instead, what we have here is we learn how to do things, and then other things like that can come along a little bit later. We learn by doing, right? When we experience and so forth, that's fundamental. So I think we have practical skills, practical experience being emphasized, not theoretical method, theoretical knowledge. All right, next, number 7 on my list here. It's from Richard Rodriguez in the 1990s, famous essayist in the American context here. Also noted Hispanic American essayist. In this case, he is talking about one of the major debates in the 1990s over bilingual education, whether particularly in the southwestern part of the country, but other parts of the United States where there was significant immigration, we should emphasize monolingual education, that all students primarily get their education in English, or whether we should have bilingual education. And Rodriguez is interestingly arguing against bilingual education for Black students and for Hispanic American students, arguing in favor of an English-based educational process. Now here's his argument here. Quote, "Education is not about self-esteem. Education is demeaning. It should be about teaching you what you don't know, what you yet need to know, how much there is yet to do." All right, pausing there, stepping outside of the quotation there. Education is not about self-esteem. Self-esteem is important in the vocabulary of those educational philosophers who think individuality is important. If individuality is important, you want to have the student to have a very strong and healthy self-esteem, and so self-esteem becomes a top value. Rodriguez is saying right off the bat, it's not about self-esteem. Instead, it's about the opposite. You don't know a whole lot of stuff, and so you should feel chastened or to some extent demeaned by the fact that you are ignorant about so many things that you yet need to know. Okay, picking up the quotation then, what is education about positively? Quote, "Part of the process of education is teaching you that you are related to people who are not you, not your parents, that you are related to black runaway slaves, and that you are related to suffragettes in the 19th century, and that you are related to Puritans, that you are related to some continuous flow of ideas, some linkage of which you are the beneficiary, the most recent link." Pausing there. Stepping outside of the quotation again, what is education about? It's about social connections, your relation to other social groupings, that you have a social connection to people whom you might or not ordinarily think of yourself as having a social connection to. Black runaway slaves, suffragettes, Puritans, and so forth. So it's not self-esteem, it's not you and your own little group, it's you in relation to all of these other groups and all of these other individuals in the whole of humankind across all of history. Then he comes back to the issue of bilingual education, or actually applies the argument that he's just made to the issue of bilingual education. The argument for bilingual education or for teaching black children their own lingo assumes that education is about self-esteem. My argument is that education is about teaching children to use the language of other people, unquote. So it's not about you and your own little group and we make you feel special because we teach you in your own language and that's all that you really need to know because that's the only important language in the world. Rather, the important thing Rodriguez is arguing is getting outside of your own little shell or your own little tiny community and being connected to the whole rest of the world, all of the other people and all of the other languages that are out there. So it's much more in a social direction as opposed to an individual direction. All right, finally, 8th on my list. This is a mission statement from the Central Public School in Guelph, Ontario, which has the distinction of being the school that I went to when I was in 1st grade. I went back in a fit of nostalgia and checked out what was going on. Actually, the school that this mission statement is for is not the school that existed physically when I was there. When I was there in the middle part of the 60s, the school for grade 1 was this ancient Victorian building. I swear you would think it was a Victorian insane asylum if you saw the pictures, but that one had been torn down and a new school had been built. And here's the mission statement for the new school. Quote, "The Central Public School community will provide a secure and collaborative environment that enables individual students to reach their potential through creating a desire to learn, enhancing self-esteem, and responding to individual learning styles." All right, I think this one is fairly clearly emphasizing the individual. There is certainly a security issue, a social security. The teachers are providing that. It does mention collaboration, so there's a social component here, but all of that is a means to an end. We're enabling individual students to reach their potential, right, as individuals, creating in them a desire to learn, so that they are self-motivating, enhancing their self-esteem, responding to individual learning styles. So the education then is much more individualized in its pedagogy and content. All right, the point of those 8 then is to illustrate all different judgments about what top educational values what top educational values are, rather, and all of them are arguey, right? That is to say, in each case, what they're doing is they're saying something else might be important, but it's not an important value, or it might be something that I just want to completely get off my list. Instead, here is the top value. Learning to see them and interpret them as they come at you in the writings of educational philosophers and educational theorists. That's an important skill, and it also then puts you in a position to assess the kinds of arguments that you will be able to see so that we can make our own judgments. What really are the most important things? If there are a dozen things that we want students to learn, what value framework or value hierarchy are we going to use to sort those into our number 1 thing, our number 2 thing, all the way on down to the list, so that we can focus our efforts appropriately, but then also when we do have to, unfortunately, sometimes make difficult choices and we can't include anything, what kinds of things are we willing to make trade-offs on, what kinds of things are we willing to cut out of the curriculum altogether. This exercise, I think, is useful for achieving that important end.